Don't sign that contract. The words cracked through the polished silence of the executive boardroom so sharply that every head turned before anyone even realized who had spoken. CEO Ethan Brooks had already uncapped his black fountain pen, his hand hovering barely 2 inches above the final signature line of a $2.8 billion acquisition that Wall Street had been anticipating for months. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath a bright spring afternoon, while inside, 14 executives, 3 corporate attorneys, and 2 investment bankers waited for the ink that would change the future of Brooks' global holdings forever. Then the impossible happened. A young black waitress wearing a simple charcoal service uniform stepped forward from the catering station along the wall. Her name tag read Naomi Carter. She couldn't have been older than 28. She carried an empty silver coffee pot in one hand and looked completely out of place, standing between billion-dollar negotiations and the signature everyone had spent 6 months preparing for. A nervous silence settled over the room. One board member frowned. Another exchanged an irritated glance with the company's chief financial officer. Someone quietly muttered that security should remove her immediately. But Naomi didn't look frightened. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't loud. She simply stared at Ethan with calm eyes that carried an urgency impossible to ignore. "Sir," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper, "please don't sign it." The general counsel pushed back his chair. "Miss, this meeting is private." The CFO's jaw tightened. Who let catering walk into the center of the room? Another executive sighed impatiently. "Can someone escort her out before we lose another minute?" Yet Ethan never looked away from Naomi. Something about her expression stopped him. It wasn't panic. It wasn't desperation. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't beg to be believed because it already knows the truth. Ethan had spent 30 years reading people across negotiating tables from New York to Tokyo. He had watched billionaires bluff, politicians smile through lies, and competitors hide fear behind expensive suits. This was different. Naomi wasn't asking for attention. She was trying to prevent something. The room grew heavier with every passing second. The pen remained suspended above the paper. No signature. No movement. Just silence stretching tighter than anyone could tolerate. "Sir," the CFO finally interrupted, forcing a practiced smile. "We're already behind schedule. Investors are waiting." Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he slowly lowered the pen, not onto the contract, but onto the polished walnut table beside it. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. One attorney glanced at his watch. Another quietly reached for the contract, as if hoping the moment would simply continue without interruption. Ethan folded his hands together and spoke with unexpected calm. "What's your name?" "Naomi Carter." "Do I know you?" She shook her head once. "No, sir." "Then why should I stop?" Naomi stepped one pace closer, careful, respectful, never raising her voice. Every security camera mounted inside the boardroom silently watched the moment unfold. Every executive watched her too. She leaned toward Ethan just enough that no one else could hear. 6 quiet words escaped her lips. The board never heard them. The attorneys never heard them. The investors waiting outside never heard them. But Ethan Brooks did. The color drained from his face. His fingers loosened. The fountain pen slipped from his hand, rolled across the conference table, and came to rest beside the unsigned contract. Nobody in the room understood why. Not yet. No one moved. The conference room that had been filled with quiet confidence only seconds earlier now felt suspended in time, as though every person inside had forgotten how to breathe. Ethan Brooks continued staring at Naomi Carter, searching her face for even the smallest sign that she was bluffing. He found none. The chief financial officer, Richard Langford, cleared his throat and forced an uneasy smile. "Mr. Brooks, we have investors waiting on 3 continents. We should proceed." Ethan slowly turned toward him, but said nothing. That silence unsettled the room far more than any argument could have. Richard had worked beside Ethan for almost 12 years. He knew the chief executive officer rarely hesitated once every detail had been verified. Today's acquisition had survived 6 months of audits, legal reviews, financial projections, and regulatory approval. Nothing was supposed to interrupt this moment, especially not a waitress from the catering staff. "Security," one director quietly called toward the door. "Please escort the employee outside." Before anyone could move, Ethan lifted one finger. "No." The single word landed with quiet authority. Two security officers immediately stopped where they stood. The attorneys exchanged uncertain looks. Richard laughed softly, hoping to ease the growing tension. Sir, she has clearly misunderstood something. We can resolve this after the meeting. Ethan finally spoke. I asked her a question. I have not heard the answer yet. Every eye shifted back toward Naomi. She remained composed, still holding the polished silver coffee pot at her side. There was no anger in her expression, only determination. You said 6 words, Ethan said evenly. How do you know that phrase? Naomi hesitated for the first time. She glanced around the room, noticing executives studying her as though she had appeared from nowhere. Because I heard someone else say them first, she answered. Richard's smile faded almost imperceptibly. Sir, one attorney interrupted. With respect, this conversation has no legal relevance. Ethan ignored him. Where? Naomi took a slow breath. Less than 20 minutes ago. The room seemed to tighten around those words. Richard folded his arms. She serves coffee downstairs. Whatever she believes she heard cannot possibly affect this transaction. Ethan looked directly at him. You seem unusually certain. Richard quickly recovered. I am certain because every document has been verified. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes returning to Naomi. Tell me exactly what happened. Naomi looked down briefly, gathering her thoughts. She had started her shift at 7 o'clock that morning like every other Tuesday. She refilled coffee stations, arranged breakfast trays, and prepared the executive dining room before anyone from the board arrived. Around 9:30, she had been asked to bring fresh coffee to a private conference room 1 floor below the main boardroom. The door had not been completely closed. As she approached, she heard 2 voices already inside. One belonged to Richard Langford. The other belonged to a man she did not recognize. She had no intention of listening, but one sentence froze her in place. The stranger quietly asked, "What if Brooks notices the numbers?" Richard answered without hesitation. He will not. He still trusts the original harbor file. Naomi had never heard those words before, yet a few seconds later another sentence caught her attention. As long as he signs before noon, nobody will ever compare the revised reports. She remembered standing perfectly still, the warm coffee pot growing heavier in her hand, wondering whether she had misunderstood everything. Then Richard said 6 words that stayed with her for the rest of the morning, the exact same 6 words she had whispered to Ethan only moments earlier. The room remained silent long after Naomi finished speaking. Nobody reached for a document. Nobody looked at the contract anymore. Every pair of eyes shifted between Ethan Brooks and Richard Langford, waiting for someone to break the tension that had quietly taken control of the meeting. Richard finally smiled again, although this time it looked practiced rather than confident. Mr. Brooks, with respect, this is nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. An employee overhears half a conversation and suddenly imagines a conspiracy. We cannot allow gossip to derail a transaction of this magnitude. Several board members nodded, relieved to hear a familiar voice restoring what sounded like reason. One investment banker leaned forward. He is right. Rumors spread quickly in large companies. Another executive quietly added, we have independent audits. Everything has already been reviewed. Ethan listened without interrupting. His expression revealed nothing. Years of negotiating billion-dollar agreements had taught him that panic usually spoke first while truth waited patiently. Naomi remained exactly where she stood, her hands still wrapped around the coffee pot. She understood how impossible her story sounded. She was not an executive. She was not an accountant. She had never attended a board meeting before today. She was simply someone who had heard something she could not ignore. Ethan looked directly at her again. You said those words stayed with you. What? Naomi answered without hesitation. Because they did not sound like people protecting a company. They sounded like people protecting a deadline. The sentence settled over the conference table like a weight no one wanted to carry. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. Tell me everything you remember. Do not guess. Do not assume. Only tell me what you heard. Naomi nodded. I delivered coffee outside the conference room. The door was slightly open. I heard the other man ask whether anyone had reviewed the harbor numbers one last time. Mr. Langford answered that nobody would compare the original harbor file after today's signature. Then the other man sounded nervous. He asked what would happen if you requested another review. Mr. Langford laughed. He said there would not be time because once the contract was signed, The integration would begin immediately. Richard shook his head with a quiet chuckle. That conversation never happened. Naomi did not even look toward him. Then explain why I know the name Harbor when I have never worked with your finance department. Richard opened his mouth, but no answer came. Ethan noticed the hesitation. It lasted barely a second, but it was enough. For 12 years, Richard had answered every difficult question instantly. Today, he searched for words. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Small details had built his career. Small pauses. Small inconsistencies. Small reactions that revealed far more than polished presentations ever could. He reached toward the unsigned contract, not to sign it, but to close the leather folder completely. The soft sound echoed through the room. Every executive immediately understood what it meant. This meeting was no longer about the acquisition. It had become something entirely different. Richard's confidence visibly weakened for the first time that morning. Ethan, he said carefully, abandoning formal titles, you cannot seriously be allowing a catering employee to dictate corporate strategy. Ethan folded his hands and answered with complete calm. No, I am allowing one unexpected question to test whether the truth is as strong as the paperwork sitting in front of me. If everything is legitimate, another hour will change nothing. But if someone is depending on my signature before noon, then delaying it may reveal exactly what they were hoping I would never see. Richard Langford slowly pushed his chair back from the conference table, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the dark hardwood floor. Ethan, delaying this acquisition will trigger penalty clauses worth millions of dollars, he said with measured confidence. Every hour matters. Ethan Brooks met his gaze without changing his expression. Interesting, he replied quietly. A few moments ago, everyone was telling me this deal had been thoroughly reviewed. Now I am being told there is no time to review it one more time. Nobody answered. The silence itself became another piece of evidence. Around the table, executives exchanged uncertain glances. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others reopened briefing folders they had already considered finished. The certainty that had filled the room at the beginning of the meeting had disappeared, replaced by questions nobody expected to ask. Ethan reached toward the conference phone positioned at the center of the table. Rebecca, his executive assistant, answered immediately. Yes, Mr. Brooks. Suspend all external announcements regarding the Harbor acquisition. Tell investor relations that the signing has been delayed pending an executive review. A brief pause followed. Understood. I will notify everyone immediately. Richard stepped forward before the call ended. That is unnecessary. Ethan looked up. Then you should have no objection to another review. Richard forced a smile that no longer reached his eyes. We already completed 3 independent audits. Ethan nodded slowly. Then a 4th should be easy. One of the outside attorneys carefully closed his laptop. Mr. Brooks, if I may, reopening the files today could create market speculation. Ethan answered calmly. A temporary delay creates speculation. Signing something I have not personally verified creates consequences. Naomi remained near the wall, saying nothing. She understood that the room no longer needed her voice. The questions she had introduced were now speaking for themselves. Ethan turned toward her again. Naomi, after you heard that conversation, what did you do? She hesitated only long enough to remember every detail exactly as it happened. I finished serving the coffee because I did not want anyone to notice I had heard anything. After that, I returned downstairs, but I could not stop thinking about those words. Then I remembered something else. Every face turned toward her. The man inside the room asked if the original Harbor file had been archived. Richard immediately interrupted. Enough. This is becoming ridiculous. Ethan raised his hand without looking away from Naomi. Continue. Mr. Langford answered that the original file had already disappeared from the shared system, and only one version would remain after today's signature. The room became still again. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Every acquisition his company completed required permanent preservation of every draft, every revision, and every financial model. Removing an original file violated one of the first governance policies he had personally written years earlier. He knew that policy by memory because he had created it after watching another corporation collapse from manipulated financial records early in his career. Richard noticed the change in Ethan's expression and quickly spoke again. There is a perfectly reasonable explanation. Ethan folded his hands on the closed contract folder. Good, he said quietly. Because in exactly 5 minutes, I want that explanation to include the original harbor file, the complete revision history, every access log from the past 30 days, and the names of everyone who opened those documents. If nothing is wrong, this meeting will continue. If something is missing, then the contract on this table is no longer the most important document in this building. 5 minutes felt longer than the previous 5 months. The enormous digital clock mounted above the presentation screen continued counting the morning away one silent second at a time, while nobody inside the boardroom spoke above a whisper. Richard Langford picked up his phone twice, then quietly set it back on the table without making a call. His confidence had begun to fracture in tiny ways that only Ethan Brooks seemed to notice. Years earlier, Ethan had learned that pressure rarely changed honest people. It exposed dishonest ones. A soft knock interrupted the silence. The conference room door opened, and Rebecca stepped inside carrying a tablet. "Mr. Brooks," she said carefully, "the Information Technology Department is already searching for the harbor files." Ethan nodded, and Rebecca hesitated. "There is an issue." Richard immediately leaned forward. "There is no issue." Rebecca looked at him briefly before returning her attention to Ethan. "The original harbor valuation file cannot be located in the shared archive." Nobody spoke. Ethan did not even blink. "Can they recover it?" Rebecca glanced at the screen again. "They are trying, but according to the access records, the file was permanently removed from the Active Directory yesterday evening." Richard stood up so quickly that his chair rolled backward several inches. "That proves nothing. Old versions are archived all the time." Ethan calmly replied, "Not permanently. Company policy requires every financial revision to remain available for audit." Richard folded his arms. "Policies are not always followed perfectly." Ethan's eyes settled on him. "That is precisely why they exist." Naomi quietly watched the conversation unfold from across the room. She had never imagined her ordinary Tuesday morning would place her inside a boardroom where every sentence seemed to change the direction of a multi-billion-dollar decision. She still held the empty coffee pot, almost forgetting it remained in her hand. Rebecca continued reading from her tablet. "There is something else. The system shows the deleted file was accessed at 9:17 this morning." Ethan frowned slightly. "By whom?" Rebecca looked uncertain. "The user credentials belong to Mr. Langford." Every executive instinctively turned toward Richard. He laughed once, but this time the sound carried no confidence at all. "Of course they do. I have been leading this acquisition from the beginning." Ethan asked another question without changing his tone. "Why access a file that no longer exists?" Richard paused. It lasted only a heartbeat, yet everyone noticed it. "I was verifying archive status." Ethan leaned back slowly. "Interesting answer." The room felt colder than before. Outside the windows, helicopters crossed the Manhattan skyline, while traffic continued moving as though nothing unusual had happened. Inside the boardroom, however, time had separated into two distinct moments, before Naomi spoke and after. Ethan looked toward Rebecca once more. "Can the deleted file be recovered?" "Our cyber recovery team believes there is a backup stored on an offline server that updates every 12 hours. They are attempting to restore it now." Ethan nodded once. "Excellent. Nobody leaves this room until they finish." Richard shook his head. "That could take an hour." Ethan answered quietly. "Then we will wait an hour." Richard looked around the table, searching for support, but the expressions staring back at him had changed. The executives who had been eager to approve the acquisition only minutes earlier were no longer thinking about deadlines or investor calls. They were thinking about one missing file, one unexplained deletion, and one waitress who had walked into the room carrying nothing more dangerous than a coffee pot and the courage to speak before a pen touched paper. The waiting became its own kind of interrogation. Nobody reached for coffee. Nobody checked the stock market scrolling silently across the television mounted on the wall. Every executive understood that the outcome of the morning no longer depended on a signature, but on a server somewhere inside the building. Ethan Brooks stood and slowly walked toward the windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. From 48 stories above the streets, thousands of people hurried through another ordinary workday, completely unaware that one missing file had frozen a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. He rested one hand against the cool glass and allowed his thoughts to drift backward. 23 years earlier, when Brooks Global was little more than a struggling regional manufacturer, Ethan had nearly signed another agreement without reading the final revisions. A junior accountant had quietly pointed out a hidden liability buried deep inside hundreds of pages of financial disclosures. The mistake would have destroyed the young company before it ever had the chance to grow. Ethan never forgot that lesson. Truth did not always arrive wearing an expensive suit. Sometimes it arrived carrying a stack of invoices. Sometimes it came from an intern. Today it had arrived carrying a silver coffee pot. Behind him the room remained almost perfectly still. Naomi stood near the service table, wondering whether she had done the right thing. She knew she had interrupted the most important meeting of her career, even though she had never expected to attend one. If she had misunderstood the conversation downstairs, she would almost certainly lose her job. Yet every time doubt entered her mind, she remembered Richard's voice saying that nobody would compare the original Harbor file after the contract was signed. Those words refused to leave her. Rebecca's tablet suddenly chimed. Every head lifted at once. She looked down at the screen as another message appeared from the cyber recovery team. They found something, she announced. Richard immediately stepped forward. Recovered. Rebecca nodded cautiously. An offline backup has been located. The restoration process is underway. Ethan turned from the window. How long? Approximately 8 minutes. Richard forced another smile. Perfect. That will settle this entire misunderstanding. Ethan studied him carefully. You seem remarkably confident about a file nobody has seen yet. Richard answered quickly. Because facts never change. Ethan replied, no. Facts remain the same. It is people who sometimes try to change them. The sentence lingered over the conference table. One of the outside directors quietly removed his reading glasses and folded his hands. Mr. Brooks, he said, if the restored file matches today's documents, we proceed as planned. Ethan nodded once. Agreed. The director continued. And if it does not? Ethan did not hesitate. Then every decision made during this acquisition will be examined from the beginning. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. She had spent years believing that people with power rarely listened to people without titles. Yet Ethan had done exactly that. He had paused an entire corporation because one employee chose honesty over silence. Another soft notification echoed through Rebecca's tablet. She looked up, her expression changing before she spoke. The backup file has finished restoring. The room became so quiet that even the faint hum of the building's air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Rebecca swallowed once before reading the next line on her screen. There are 2 Harbor valuation reports. Their totals are not the same. Rebecca connected her tablet to the massive display at the front of the boardroom. 2 financial reports appeared side by side, nearly identical at first glance. The company logo matched. The page count matched. Even the executive summary appeared unchanged. But as Rebecca slowly highlighted the valuation tables, the differences emerged one line at a time. The restored report estimates Harbor Technologies at $2,460 million, she said carefully. The version prepared for today's signature values the same company at $2,800 million. A murmur spread around the table. Several directors leaned forward at once, comparing the columns with narrowed eyes. One outside auditor quietly removed his glasses and looked again as though hoping he had misread the numbers. Ethan Brooks remained perfectly still. Continue, he said. Rebecca nodded. The revenue projections were increased by nearly 18%. Operating expenses were reduced. Future contract renewals were marked as guaranteed instead of pending. These revisions increased the acquisition value by more than $300 million. Richard Langford immediately stood. Those were updated assumptions based on the latest negotiations. Ethan turned toward him. Then why does the restored report contain no approval record for those changes? Rebecca touched another section of the screen. That is the second problem. Every revision normally requires electronic authorization from the Finance Committee. The restored file shows 3 required approvals are missing. Richard answered quickly. The system occasionally delays approval logs. Rebecca slowly shook her head. Not this system. The approval fields are completely empty. The room fell silent once again. Ethan walked toward the display without taking his eyes off the 2 reports. He studied each page carefully, tracing the highlighted figures with one finger. Then he noticed something smaller than the numbers themselves. Rebecca, he said quietly, zoom in on the metadata. Within seconds, another window appeared. File history filled the screen. Creation dates, revision times, user credentials, every digital fingerprint left behind during months of work. Ethan read each line without speaking. Finally, he pointed toward one entry near the bottom. This version was modified at 9:12 this morning. Rebecca nodded. Yes. Ethan continued. 5 minutes before Naomi heard that conversation. Nobody said a word. The timeline fit together with unsettling precision. Richard folded his arms tightly across his chest. Metadata proves nothing. Someone from information technology could have opened the file automatically. Rebecca calmly replied, automatic system backups never overwrite financial assumptions. These revisions required manual editing. Ethan slowly faced Richard again. His voice remained steady, but the warmth had disappeared completely. You asked me to sign before noon. You insisted there was no time for another review. You told this board every document had already been verified. Yet the numbers changed less than an hour before the meeting began. Richard looked around the room searching for support, but the faces that had trusted him for years were now filled with uncertainty. Naomi quietly watched from the back of the room. Still holding the empty coffee pot she had almost forgotten was in her hands. She had walked into the meeting believing she might lose her job for speaking out. Instead, she was watching a room full of powerful executives discover that the smallest voice in the building had been the first to notice something everyone else had overlooked. Ethan closed the financial report on the screen and spoke with calm authority. We are finished discussing assumptions. From this moment forward, we are looking for facts, and facts have a way of revealing far more than anyone expects. The atmosphere inside the boardroom shifted again, but this time the change was impossible to ignore. What had begun as doubt was becoming a pattern, and patterns were far more dangerous than isolated mistakes. Ethan Brooks slowly walked back to his seat without taking his eyes off the financial reports displayed across the enormous screen. Rebecca, he said calmly, show us every change made during the last 24 hours. Her fingers moved quickly across the tablet. Within seconds, a detailed revision timeline filled the display. Every edit appeared with a precise timestamp, a user credential, and a description of what had changed. The executives leaned forward together. Entire revenue projections had been rewritten. Risk assessments had been softened. Contract renewal probabilities had quietly shifted from uncertain to highly likely. None of those revisions carried the required committee approvals. One independent director frowned. These are not formatting edits. These are valuation drivers. Another board member added. Every one of these changes increased the purchase price. Ethan remained silent, allowing everyone else to reach the obvious conclusion on their own. Richard Langford suddenly stood and adjusted his suit jacket. This presentation lacks context. Negotiations continued until late yesterday evening. Updated information arrives constantly during acquisitions. Ethan looked at him. Then provide the context. Richard nodded confidently. I will have my team bring the supporting documentation. Rebecca interrupted before he could reach for his phone. I already requested it 15 minutes ago. Richard turned toward her. Excellent. Rebecca slowly lowered the tablet. They cannot find it. The room became still once again. What do you mean they cannot find it? Richard asked. Rebecca answered carefully. There are no supporting memorandums attached to the revised numbers. There are no updated market studies. There are no revised customer contracts. The financial assumptions exist, but the evidence normally required to justify them does not. One attorney quietly closed his notebook. That violates every acquisition protocol we have. Richard quickly replied. Someone must have stored the files locally instead of uploading them. Ethan spoke for the first time in nearly a minute. Who approved those revisions? Nobody answered. Rebecca searched another report before looking back up. According to the system, the approval request was never submitted. Ethan slowly folded his hands together. Then nobody approved them. Richard's voice became noticeably sharper. You are reaching conclusions without complete information. Ethan nodded once. Exactly. That is why I refused to sign. The words settled heavily across the conference table. Naomi quietly watched from the far side of the room. She had spent years serving coffee to executives without anyone remembering her name after meetings ended. Today, the same people were listening because facts had begun speaking louder than job titles. Rebecca's tablet chimed again. She read the incoming message twice before raising her eyes. Cybersecurity has completed another review of the deleted files. Ethan asked, "What did they find?" Rebecca took a slow breath. The original Harbor report was not simply deleted. It was replaced. Both actions occurred from the same executive account within 4 minutes of each other. Every person in the room instinctively looked toward Richard Langford. For the first time since the meeting began, he did not immediately have an answer. Richard Langford slowly looked around the boardroom, as though searching for someone willing to rescue the narrative he had carefully built over the past 6 months. Nobody spoke. The directors who had trusted his presentations only an hour earlier now avoided meeting his eyes. Ethan Brooks remained seated with both hands resting calmly on the closed contract folder. He was no longer evaluating a business deal. He was evaluating the people responsible for bringing it to his desk. "Rebecca," Ethan said evenly, "lock every Harbor acquisition file. Effective immediately, no document is to be edited, deleted, copied, or transferred without my written authorization." "Already completed," Rebecca answered. Cybersecurity activated preservation mode the moment the recovery team confirmed the replacement. Richard's expression tightened. "You froze an active transaction without consulting me." Ethan replied without emotion. "That is correct. I am the chief financial officer." Ethan nodded once. "And I am still the chief executive officer." The room fell silent again. One independent director cleared his throat. "Mr. Brooks, should we notify the audit committee?" Ethan answered immediately. "Not yet. First, I want to understand whether this was one person's decision or part of something larger." Richard leaned forward. "You are assuming intent where there may have been nothing more than administrative error." Ethan looked directly at him. "Administrative errors leave records. Deliberate decisions leave patterns. So far I have seen a pattern." Rebecca's tablet vibrated once more. She glanced at the message, then raised her eyes. Cybersecurity found another discrepancy. Ethan motioned for her to continue. The revised valuation report was not only created from Mr. Langford's executive account. It was exported twice this morning before the meeting began. Richard answered almost instantly. "I shared it with our outside advisors." Rebecca shook her head. "The destination addresses were not our outside advisors. They were private encrypted accounts that are not registered in the company directory." Several board members exchanged concerned looks. One attorney quietly whispered to another before opening a compliance handbook. Ethan remained remarkably calm. "Can those accounts be identified?" Rebecca nodded. "Information technology is tracing them now." Richard's confidence continued to erode beneath the weight of each new fact. "This is becoming excessive," he said. "Every minute we delay damages shareholder value." Ethan stood slowly, walked to the center of the room, and looked around the table. Shareholder value is not protected by rushing a signature. It is protected by making certain the signature deserves to exist. His words settled heavily over every chair in the room. Naomi listened from the back of the boardroom, still saying nothing. She had interrupted the meeting because she believed someone should know the truth. She had never imagined the truth would continue revealing itself without her saying another word. Ethan turned toward her. "Naomi." She looked up. "Yes, sir. You had every reason to stay silent today." She answered softly. "I almost did." Ethan gave a small nod. "What changed your mind?" Naomi looked briefly toward the unsigned contract before answering. "My grandmother used to tell me that silence can protect comfort for a little while, but it never protects what is right. When I saw your pen above that paper, I realized I would remember my silence for the rest of my life if I walked away." No one interrupted her. No one dismissed her. Even the directors who had questioned her presence now listened with complete attention. Before anyone could speak again, Rebecca's tablet sounded one final notification. She looked at the screen, her expression growing noticeably more serious. "The cyber team identified one of the private accounts," she said quietly. "It belongs to the chairman of the board." Edit the words lingered in the boardroom long after Rebecca lowered her tablet. Nobody reacted immediately because nobody wanted to believe what they had just heard. The chairman of the board, Charles Whitmore, had not attended the meeting in person. He was scheduled to join by secure video after the contract was signed, congratulating everyone on another successful acquisition. Now his name had appeared inside an investigation that was growing larger with every passing minute. Richard Langford finally broke the silence. "There has to be another explanation." Ethan Brooks looked at him steadily. "Then this is your opportunity to provide one." Richard opened his mouth, paused, and quietly closed it again. Ethan walked to the conference phone and pressed a single button. Rebecca, connect Charles Whitmore immediately. Yes, Mr. Brooks. Within seconds, the large display changed from financial reports to a secure video connection. The screen flickered once before Charles appeared from a polished office overlooking the Chicago skyline. He smiled politely. Ethan, I heard the signing has been delayed. Is there a problem? Ethan answered with the same calm voice he had maintained all morning. There is a question that needs an answer. Charles leaned back comfortably. Go ahead. Ethan nodded toward the display beside him. Rebecca restored the audit timeline showing the deleted files, the replacement records, and the executive account history. Cybersecurity traced one of the encrypted transfers to a private account registered in your name. Charles looked at the screen without changing his expression. That cannot be correct. Rebecca quietly replied. Our team verified the ownership through 2 independent authentication records. Charles remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. Even if that account belongs to me, receiving documents does not prove wrongdoing. Ethan agreed immediately. Correct. Receiving them proves nothing by itself. Every executive listened carefully. Ethan continued. Changing valuation numbers without documented approval is another matter. Deleting the original report is another matter. Requesting an immediate signature before anyone could compare both v. No one attempted to leave the boardroom. The polished conference table that had been prepared for celebration now felt like the center of an entirely different kind of meeting. Charles Whitmore remained on the large screen, his confident posture replaced by careful silence. Richard Langford sat motionless, staring at the recovered message displayed before him as though the words might somehow disappear if he waited long enough. Ethan Brooks slowly looked around the room before speaking again. Rebecca, notify the chair of the audit committee, outside corporate counsel, and the ethics office. Tell them to meet us immediately. Preserve every document, every communication log, and every server image connected to the Harbor acquisition. Already in progress, Rebecca replied. The preservation orders have been acknowledged. Ethan nodded once. Good. One of the independent directors finally broke the silence. Mr. Brooks, I recommend that everyone directly connected to these revisions be relieved of decision-making authority until the review is complete. Ethan answered without hesitation. I agree. He turned toward Richard. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the independent investigation. Your access to financial systems is suspended. Richard looked up in disbelief. Based on incomplete evidence. Ethan remained calm. Based on enough evidence to ensure the investigation remains independent. Richard stood slowly. I have devoted 12 years to this company. Ethan met his eyes. That is exactly why this is difficult. But loyalty to one individual can never be placed above responsibility to every employee, every shareholder, and every customer who trusts this company. On the video screen, Charles Whitmore finally spoke again. Ethan, perhaps we should discuss this privately. Ethan gently shook his head. The decisions that brought us here were not made privately enough. The response will be transparent. Charles lowered his eyes for a brief moment. No one else at the table argued. They understood the meeting had reached a point where reputation could only be protected through accountability. Rebecca received another message and quietly smiled for the first time that morning. The audit committee has confirmed they are taking control of the investigation. Outside counsel is requesting that all recovered files remain displayed exactly as they are. Ethan thanked her with a small nod before turning toward the directors. The Harbor acquisition is officially suspended until every figure is independently verified. We will not move another inch until we know every number deserves our confidence. Around the table, one director after another voiced agreement. The unanimous vote required less than a minute. The contract that had seemed destined for an immediate signature now rested untouched inside its leather folder. Ethan then looked toward Naomi. She appeared almost uncomfortable with the attention now focused on her. Miss Carter, he said, this morning you acted with honesty even though you believed it might cost you your job. That decision protected this company more effectively than any report presented in this room. Naomi lowered her eyes modestly. I only did what I believed was right. Ethan smiled gently. The strongest ethical decisions are often described exactly that way. For the first time all morning, the tension inside the boardroom eased. Not because every question had been answered, but because everyone finally understood that the search for truth had become more important than protecting appearances, and that realization would shape the future of the company far more than any signature ever could. The boardroom gradually emptied as attorneys, auditors, and compliance officers began their work, but Ethan Brooks remained seated at the long conference table, looking at the unsigned contract that had nearly altered the future of his company forever. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected across the glass towers of Manhattan, making the city appear unchanged even though everything inside Brooks Global had shifted in less than 2 hours. Naomi Carter quietly placed the silver coffee pot on the service cart for the first time since entering the room. She had almost reached the door when Ethan's voice stopped her. "Naomi, would you stay for just a moment?" She turned and nodded respectfully. The remaining directors quietly gathered their papers and stepped outside, leaving the two of them alone except for Rebecca, who continued organizing documents near the far end of the room. Ethan looked at Naomi with genuine curiosity rather than authority. "Earlier you said those 6 words stayed with you because they did not sound like people protecting a company. That kind of judgment usually comes from experience. Who taught you to recognize it?" Naomi smiled softly, the first real smile anyone had seen from her all day. "My father." Ethan listened without interrupting. He worked in corporate accounting for almost 30 years. He always told me that numbers never create dishonesty. People do. He believed the smallest change hidden inside a report could eventually become the biggest problem in a company. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. Those words sounded strangely familiar. Naomi continued. "When I was a little girl, he would bring home old financial statements after confidential information had been removed. He taught me how every number connected to another number. He said integrity was not about mathematics. It was about character." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "What was his name?" "Daniel Carter." The room suddenly became very quiet again. Ethan looked at Naomi for several long seconds before speaking. "Daniel Carter worked here?" Naomi looked surprised. "Yes, sir. Many years ago." Ethan's expression softened with recognition. "I remember him." Rebecca looked up from across the room, equally surprised. Ethan continued. "I was a young division president back then. Your father once challenged one of my budget projections during a quarterly review. Everyone else agreed with me, but he quietly asked me to verify one assumption before presenting it to the board." Naomi listened carefully. Ethan smiled faintly at the memory. "He was right. I thanked him afterward, and he told me something I never forgot. He said, a company can survive a bad quarter. It cannot survive leaders who stop asking honest questions." Naomi lowered her eyes, visibly moved. He repeated that sentence at home for years. Ethan stood and slowly walked toward the windows again. "Your father influenced this company more than he probably realized." Naomi took a quiet breath. "He passed away 3 years ago. He always believed people should speak when something felt wrong, even if nobody else wanted to hear it." Ethan turned back toward her with quiet respect. "Then today his lesson continued through you." Rebecca stepped forward with another folder in her hands. "Mr. Brooks, the audit committee has completed its preliminary recommendation." Ethan accepted the folder, but looked first at Naomi instead of the documents. "Sometimes a company spends millions of dollars searching for the right leadership principles," he said. "This morning those principles walked into the room, wearing a service uniform and carrying the values someone else had the wisdom to teach long before any of us noticed." 3 weeks later, the executive boardroom looked remarkably different. The Harbor acquisition had been permanently canceled after independent investigators confirmed that the financial projections had been intentionally altered before the scheduled signing. Brooks Global released a detailed public statement explaining that the transaction had been suspended because internal controls had worked exactly as they were designed to work. Shareholders responded with unexpected confidence. Analysts praised the company's transparency instead of criticizing the delay. What many people expected to become a corporate crisis had instead become an example of responsible leadership. Richard Langford officially resigned during the investigation, while Charles Whitmore stepped down as chairman of the board after the Independent Ethics Committee completed its review. Brooks Global announced a series of governance reforms, including stronger document verification procedures and expanded protections for employees who raised ethical concerns regardless of their position inside the company. Ethan Brooks insisted that every recommendation be implemented without exception. On Monday morning, the same boardroom welcomed a much smaller gathering. There were no investment bankers, no acquisition attorneys, and no billion-dollar contracts waiting for signatures. Instead, Ethan, Rebecca, several directors, and Naomi Carter sat around the conference table discussing something entirely different. Ethan placed a simple folder in front of Naomi. "This is not a reward," he said with a warm smile. "It is an opportunity." Naomi opened the folder carefully. Inside was an offer to join Brooks Global's corporate ethics and compliance division through a fully funded professional development program that included college tuition assistance, financial certification training, and direct mentorship from senior executives. Naomi looked up in surprise. "Sir, I have never worked in corporate finance." Ethan smiled. "Neither had many of our best leaders when they first started. Skills can be taught. Character cannot." Rebecca quietly added, "Every person on the leadership committee voted in favor of this unanimously." Naomi remained silent for a moment before closing the folder gently. "I accept," she said softly, "but only if I can help build a culture where people never feel afraid to speak up." Ethan nodded without hesitation. "That is exactly why you are here." He reached into his briefcase and removed the same black fountain pen that had nearly signed the harbor agreement weeks earlier. This time he placed a different document on the table. It was the formal resolution adopting the company's new ethics initiative. Ethan looked at Naomi before uncapping the pen. 3 weeks ago you stopped this pen because signing would have been the wrong decision." He smiled gently. "Today I would like you to tell me whether this one deserves my signature." Naomi carefully read every page. Nobody rushed her. Nobody reminded her about schedules or deadlines. After several quiet minutes, she looked up and smiled. "Yes, sir. This one protects people before it protects profits." Ethan signed the resolution with a steady hand, then carefully set the pen beside the document. The room remained quiet, but this silence felt entirely different from the one that had filled the boardroom weeks earlier. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that follows the right decision. Ethan looked toward the Manhattan skyline before speaking one final time. Companies are not remembered because every leader was perfect. They are remembered because someone had the courage to stop a mistake before it became a tradition. Naomi smiled, remembering the lesson her father had repeated throughout her childhood. Truth does not become more valuable because an executive speaks it. Truth has always had value. It simply waits for someone with enough integrity to refuse to ignore it. And on one ordinary Tuesday morning, just before ink touched paper, that courage changed the future of an entire company.